My name is Jerome Ferry. My cameraman is Alan Eggers. We're doing an interview with Bill Munsell, one of the founders of the former CMF&Z, a Cedar Rapids-based agribusiness, advertising, and public relations agency for many years in Cedar Rapids. Bill, tell us when and where you were born.
Well, first let me tell you, you handled that mouthful pretty well. I was born in Lincoln, Nebraska, 1925.
What was your parents' names?
Everett and Gertrude Munsell.
Mm-hmm. What was your mother's maiden name?
Her name was De Sautel. That's capital D French, capital D, capital S-A-U, T-E-L-L-E.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any brothers and sisters?
I had one sister, Dora.
Mm-hmm. What was her name?
Her name, Dora.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dora. Is she still living?
She's living in Canada. She was just here a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm. What was your dad's occupation?
Well, he was primarily a farmer in those years. That was in the late 20s and 30s. Then in the mid-30s, 36 I believe to be precise, that was in the midst of the Dust Bowl, and we were in Nebraska, and the place was blown away. And he elected to retire from that work and moved to Boone, where he became an automotive parts salesman.
Mm-hmm. And high school, Bill?
High school was in Boone.
And what year did you graduate?
1942, big year.
Yeah.
First year of the war.
And did you have your mind on going into the service when you graduated from high school?
Well, I volunteered, pardon me, I volunteered in November of 92 at age 17, which is a little early, because I had an opportunity to enlist in an Air Force band that was being put together down in Carlsbad, New Mexico by one of my early music teachers. I was a trumpet player through all of my high school years and did pretty well. And this guy, Clayton Jeanette, was putting together what was to be a premier Air Force band, and he called back to some of his students and some of his contemporaries, and he recruited a bunch of us, and we had I had Gordon Bird, who was the band leader at Drake, and Bob Bagley, who was the band leader at Roosevelt High School, and guys like that, and some kids like myself, and we were all clustered down in Carlsbad to join the Army on November 11, 1962. Pardon me, 42.
Do you remember playing any big events?
Oh, sure, we played big events all the time. We were a hard-working group. There weren't just Iowa people in this thing. This involved some guys from studio bands in California. We had a French horn player from the Boston Symphony, big-time group, and we played everything from the bugle in the morning to get the troops up to putting the officers to bed at 2 in the morning over at the officers' club, and rehearsed in between. We didn't get shot at, but we sure worked hard. It was fun business.
Yeah. And then what year were you discharged?
I came out of the Army in 46, went immediately to Iowa City. At that time you could do a mid-semester enrollment, and by taking just one course for 8 weeks you could do a semester's worth of credit in that course, and I started in April of 46 and just kept going.
Do you
Went to
remember
summer school?
Mm-hmm. Do you remember any of your professors down there at the University of Iowa?
Well, the professor that I remember primarily is a guy named Philip Ward Burton, who was the head of the advertising department. He had built it, and he was the cornerstone of the advertising teaching operation. And he had more impact on he and one other guy, Al Whitman up in Minneapolis, had more impact on my life than any other two individuals that I can remember.
So what was your first job after
First
school?
job coming out of school, I was the merchandising director of the Des Moines Register and Tribune,
And,
which was not as big a job as it would seem to sound.
Mm-hmm. Then your next one?
In 1951, which was 2 years after I started the Register, I came to Cedar Rapids and joined the W.D. Lyon Company.
Were they looking for help, or did somebody give you a lead?
Well, both. He was looking for help, and a friend of mine who worked at the Register at the time was gracious enough to suggest I might want to go over and talk to Wally Lyon, which I did, and they hired me, and I moved over and came just 2 years after I had gone to work at the Register.
Where was the office? Where was Lyons' office at that time?
Well, it was in the old Me Too building, 3rd floor. You walked in the elevator going one direction, and you got out in the backside. It was an interesting operation.
This was an advertising business?
Oh, yes.
Did he specialize in any particular line of advertising?
He was just doing anything we could do. The agency was very small, and it was about, it couldn't have been more than $1.5 million worth of billings at that time.
Mm-hmm.
In the Me Too building.
Yeah.
Weaver Whitworth's grocery store, you know.
Mm-hmm. And then your next job?
Well, 2 years later, which would be 53, I went to Minneapolis and joined a firm named Bruce B. Brewer. They had offices in Kansas City. And in Minneapolis, I joined the Minneapolis group. My primary account responsibility there was with the #1 dog food brand, Nutrena, which was sold through grocery and feed stores. And it was a strong, dominant dog food brand, dry dog food, sold throughout primarily the Midwest and South.
Mm-hmm. And then after that?
Well, after that, I went to Campbell Mithun.
Mithun?
That's Mithun,
Mm-hmm.
which was the dominant advertising agency in the Midwest at that time, including agencies in Chicago.
What were
And
some?
my first assignment there was my first exposure to a national brand, which was the Pillsbury Company. I worked initially on hot roll mix, subsequently on their fresh dough division, which is the biscuits and the cinnamon rolls and the cookies and pizza crusts, and it was a lot of fun doing that because I was introducing national stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We used a lot of Arthur Godfrey, who was a kind of a history historian himself. You couldn't lead Arthur, and the more you tried to lead Arthur, the more trouble you'd get into because he didn't really like agency people, and he'd take any script you gave him and do it his own way, and frequently including starting at the top and ad-libbing the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
But he was incredibly effective, and we could count on any introduction of a Pillsbury fresh dough product that he kicked off to be in full distribution and selling the next morning.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned you worked on the Ham's Beer account.
I did that after working on the Pillsbury business. Ham's Beer was a major beer brand at that time. This is middle 50s, you understand.
Was that the Land of Sky Blue Waters?
You bet it was. Which everybody, you'll hear a lot of people take credit for having done that. I'd like to have done that, but I didn't. I was there after it had been initiated. Same can be said about the development of the Ham's Bear. A lot of people did the Bear, well, a lot of people didn't do the Bear. Cleo Hovel was primarily responsible for having done the Bear, but a lot of us worked with the Bear after it was up and running, and that was an extremely successful campaign that many people worked on, and it was a very successful brand. It's pretty much gone to hell now. But,
yeah, I often wonder, where was the scene taken? The woodsy scene, the
well,
lake? And
there were the primary scene that you saw on television was shot out in Lake Arrowhead in California. And,
not Minnesota, the Northwoods.
Not Minnesota, the Northwoods, but it looked like the Minnesota Northwoods. And then we had a tank in the studio that could be used for long shots and scenes that looked just like a lake in northern Minnesota.
Yeah.
Interesting thing about the Land of Sky Blue Waters, which resonated very well to Midwesterners and everybody that knew Minnesota, it didn't do well with the black market. The black market didn't understand it, couldn't relate to it. We were a #1 brand throughout much of the Midwest, but we really stunk it up in southern Chicago, for example, which is a heavily black-oriented beer market. I can remember spending a day with one of the Ham's guys going from tavern to tavern to tavern through southern Minnesota to see what was going on here and what might we be able to do that would be better. Learned that market just doesn't relate to the Land of Sky Blue Waters. Many had not been there. They couldn't bring it into their mind. They couldn't relate it to a beer. They were more interested in the king of beers, which was Budweiser. We were about a strong fourth at the time.
Mm-hmm. What was your next move then, Bill, after you left Minnesota?
After I left Campbell Mithun in Minneapolis, I went to their office in Hollywood and Vine. We had a small office there. In part, we were there for production of television commercials. But we had some of our own clients there, one of which was Laura Scudder Potato Chips, which was a major West Coast brand. That was in 1960 that I went there, 60, 61. Left there in 62 to come back to Cedar Rapids. In large part because I always kind of thought it would be fun to get back to Cedar Rapids and live there, but I also thought it would be fun to make a contribution to putting together a major advertising agency in what the industry would consider to be an unlikely place. got to remember Cedar Rapids is not New York or L.A. But that doesn't mean you can't bring people to to Cedar Rapids and build a good agency, which is what we set out to do.
Did you come back to work for the Lions Company then?
Came back with Deputy Lion Company. At that time, they had about somewhere between 25 and 30 employees, which was somewhat more than we really needed at the time. The buildings were roughly in the $2 million class. I remember when I was introduced to the group, I was asked to say a few words and made the observation that I thought that we had a lot of opportunity and promise here, and would no doubt live to see the day when the agency could be as much as $10 million.
You speak of billings. Is the term billings, is that unique to this type of business? Explain billings to us for people who wouldn't.
Well, billings would be somewhat the equivalent of gross sales in many other companies. Billings is really what you bill to clients, an accumulation of the media expenses that they have incurred, production expenses. It's an industry term that means the amount of gross dollar volume that you've been responsible for.
Was Mr. Lyon still living?
W.D. Lyon was very much living at the time. He wanted me to come back and be his number 2 guy and help him take the agency to the next plateau.
You were able to bring quite a bit to the company with your experience that you had already.
Well, I brought back national level packaged goods experience from the work I had done on hams and the work I had done on Pillsbury. And importantly, I had done some work on a Procter & Gamble brand Charmin tissue, which I always think of as my doctor's degree in this business, working on a Procter brand, because they're so good and so thorough and so fundamental in the way they do things.
Yeah. So what was the official name of the company then?
It's still W.D. Lyon.
Yeah. And then did you take a position in the...
I was executive vice president and owned some stock. That was part of the package in coming back here.
At what time did it become Crestwell Munsell?
Schubert and Zerbel? Well, that was like 1964, as I recall. When we acquired Wally Lyon's interest, he retired, and Wally was in poor health. It's well known that he had a serious problem with alcohol. Said Cook of the AA group and I did everything anybody ever knew how to do, trying to treat and help Wally. And it was impossible to really bring him to what he needed to do with his life. So he elected to retire, and we bought his interest and changed the name to Crestwell, Munsell, Schubert, and Zerbel.
Did you have any large accounts at that time or at this time?
The biggest account we had then was Better Homes and Gardens magazine. We were responsible for their advertising of what they called newsstand sales. That would be the, not subscription, but the sale of Better Homes and Gardens on a news rack. We did that, it was almost exclusively radio, and the star of that advertising was Art Linkletter, with whom I also had worked on Pillsbury, who was a different cat than Arthur Godfrey by a country mile.
And then at this time, was it around this time where you picked up the Highland potato chip account?
I went to Highland because they were a relatively high-profile packaged goods account in this part of the country, and I had the Scudder potato chip background from the West Coast in my briefcase, and that was that was an important brand nationally, and it was an important name for anybody that knew potato chips. So I was able to leverage that experience to helping acquire the Highland potato chip brand, which I figured if we could get that, it would be a good demonstration of what we could do with packaged goods. And my ambition when I came back here was to try to make a really credible packaged goods agency out of this advertising agency and what the industry would call an unlikely place, Cedar Rapids.
Mm-hmm. Were you still in the Whitwer building then?
Still in the Whitwer building.
Didn't you eventually move though to Merchants?
We next moved to the 4th floor of the Merchants National Bank building. We had all of that. And as we outgrew that, we temporarily, pardon me, we lived temporarily down in the building that housed the gas company. I've forgotten the name of that building, but we had a floor there for a temporary operation while we built our own space out at Signal Ridge.
Then when did you become president of the company?
That was in '69 when Cresswell retired.
And then
We
when
had
you
moved to the bank building by then.
Mhm. And then when you become president, did you have something in your mind that you were really going to be able to make this company grow? Did you have a plan that?
I had the same plan that we started with, which was to leverage the experience we had, reach out and find and recruit and get good people who would come to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and do the kind of work that you need if you're going to try to be a major packaged goods advertising source.
Yeah.
The thing about that whole concept, though, was that it wasn't really very credible. And we could have great work done here, and we did. We had great work done for Highland potato chips and some great work done for a little brand called Gus Glazer Meat, Tone Spices. Throughout all this, we were working with Better Homes and Gardens. So we had some name stuff going, but when you're up against agencies in Minneapolis and Chicago and New York, it's not real credible to stand there and try to have them believe that you're a full-fledged, really good packaged goods company. And we were doing okay, and we were growing as time went on, but it became fairly clear in the late 60s, early 70s perhaps, that we weren't really going to be as big and dominant a resource as I had originally hoped.
You were telling me, Bill, in the 1969 time frame, you started losing a few large accounts and you changed directions of your company.
We were confronted within a period of about 6 months, as I recall, with a major setback when the Meredith people decided to move the Better Homes and Gardens magazine advertising from our shop to a major shop in Chicago, primarily for the credibility concern that I mentioned a moment ago. It was a more prestigious place for them to be, J. Walter in Chicago, than W.D. Linn in Cedar Rapids, so we lost a major piece of business there. We lost our Highland potato chip business, and that was a story that I won't get into because it involved some problems within the client organization that led to a misunderstanding of what we were trying to do. We did some outstanding work for that Highland potato chip bunch, by the way.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, the slogan, chippiest chips around, was that your?
Highland, the chippiest chips around, was indeed the battle cry that we developed them, and it was a cornerstone of all the work we did for them. It really set them apart from the other people because it was a kind of an interesting way of saying the best in town without using the word best, which I've always had a problem with trying to claim that something is better than or the best because it becomes so addy sounding at that point that it loses credibility. But if you say it's the chippiest chips around, it says the same thing without having used those words, and it's far more credible and more memorable. So we did some good work with Hy-Vee at that time too. They came to us in the early 60s and wanted us to introduce them to television. And the first work we did for them was a little camp. They want Dwight Friedenberg, who was the head guy at Hy-Vee at the time, wanted to get into television, and they weren't exactly sure of what they wanted to do with it, but they wanted to experiment with it. And they said, "Why don't you develop a program for us that would help improve our business at the front end of the week, meaning Monday and Tuesday?" Grocery advertising historically had been done on Thursdays and Fridays. Those were shopping days in those days. They wanted to see if they could shift some business up to the front of the week, Monday and Tuesday, and we did indeed do some work on that, and then that led to some other work on their private label business, which interestingly enough, well, let me tell you this in two stages. The first campaign we did for Hy-Vee after having experimented with moving business to the front end of the week was a brand campaign that the slogan was, "Where there's a helpful smile in every aisle." To this day, that was 63. To this day, this is 2003, 40 years later, they're still using that basic campaign, and as a matter of fact, they just recently revisited the original work in the campaign, and they're showing some of the footage that we shot way back in the 60s. The basis for that campaign, I mentioned a moment ago, we try hard not to say that something is best or better. The basis, and we're also trying to find things that separate and differentiate our client from competition. The thing that differentiated Hy-Vee we discovered by going out in the stores. Ron Howes and I went out and spent some time visiting a dozen of their stores. And stores, retail grocery stores, pretty much tend to be retail grocery stores. But there was one thing about Hy-Vee that was different. We noticed that as people would come in and stop to ask for information from a stock boy or a clerk who might be working in the aisles, ask where are the peas or where's such and such, those kids would stand up from squatting on the floor or whatever they're doing and literally lead the customer by the hand around to the aisle where they were trying to locate. And they did it with a smile. They didn't just go do it, nor did they point. But so out of that came the idea, these guys do things differently from the standpoint of the service they provide in the aisles. Hence, where there's a helpful smile in every aisle, which lives to this day. Major breakthrough in television. Grocery stores were not advertising on television then. Hy-Vee wanted to do that. We showed them how to do that. They're still doing it.
When in '69, when your business started losing some accounts, did you think of changing direction as which way your company would?
Yeah, we did, and I started to mention that we lost the Better Homes and Gardens work, and we lost the Highland potato chips, which were two showpiece pieces of our business, and they were important dollar-wise as well. But we didn't sit down and make a great big production out of it, but we began to talk about thinking of different things we might ought to do. And Ron Howes in particular said, it really is not very credible for us to be trying to tell people in Chicago or wherever that we're really very good in major national consumer work when we live in a place like Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It doesn't ring true. But what people do think we can do is anything that might be related to the agricultural industry. Why? Because we live in a cornfield, is the perception that people who don't live in the Midwest have of anybody that does. So we began to slowly shift our emphasis to agriculturally oriented clients and began to get away from trying to be a packaged goods hotshot to being the very best that there could be in agriculture. Could we hold it a minute?
So, did you actually get into the agribusiness at this time then?
We had been in the agricultural business for some time with Kent Feeds. Bob Schubert had worked on that business for a long, long time, and he had corralled Leo Greco, and they did some things with dealers, and they had dances that dealers would give tickets to, and Leo did a lot of the work on air. And we did a lot of good work then, but it wasn't what we were trying to be. But we did have enough background there that we could go and with some credibility talk to other ag clients and explain that we do know this business and be of help to you. And the first one that really came through there was Monsanto. We were given an assignment to just do a campaign on a herbicide they had that was called Ramrod. It was a corn herbicide. And that led then to working for a subsidiary of theirs, which was called the Farmers Hybrid Companies. That was a company that had a hybrid corn, and they had a hybrid breeding stock, swine breeding stock. Very sophisticated, very good breeding stock. But it had this kind of a funny name, Farmers Hybrid, that people didn't really understand hybrid animals. They could understand hybrid corn and hybrid beans, but a hybrid animal was kind of a tough thing to grasp. And we did some focus group work on it, and I remember Jeff Davis was leading the group, and he asked the group at one point, said, what do you look for when you're looking to buy a boar? And one guy just instantly responded, boar power. And everybody said, yeah, that's it, boar power. And Ron Howes was sitting over in the corner with Bill Fritz listening to all this. And they immediately started doing ads before the focus group was concluded. They had ads that featured the big word, boar power, with appropriate illustrations to go with it. That led then to some television work that I think was responsible for putting us on the map. We did a commercial for boar power that stripped down. It featured a boar coming from one side of the field and a goat coming from the other. No copy, but slow, dramatic, romantic music, and as they kept getting closer and closer and closer. It finally got to the point where they touched noses. Then the announcer came in and said, "Our boards are lovers. Bore power." Well, it just really tore up the industry. Consumer interested people as well as ag. Everything would stop in a bar when the commercial would come on, and they would stop and listen to that commercial, and then they would hoot and holler and laugh and just have a good time. And it really, really was a lot of fun. Incredible talk value, and it led to a front page Wall Street Journal story. Long carryover story explaining the whole campaign, and it was done by these little guys out in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And it really gave us a great amount of credibility, and we had instant recognition when we went to other major clients to talk about doing their work, and we could show the bore power work, which everybody knew that had been recognized as the outstanding work in the ag industry that year and years that followed.
So you got national recognition when this hit the Wall Street Journal.
And that's an unlikely story for the Wall Street Journal to be handling. Advertising on swine breeding stock? Come on, that's not what we do here at Wall Street. So it was dramatic, and it was very helpful to us. We thank them a lot for helping put us on the map. Well, as we moved into the 70s with the big success of the bore power program, we also made a major corporate ownership shift. And I was approached one day by an old friend and client, Jim Mortensen, who was at the time the #2 guy at Young and Rubicam in New York. And Jim said, "Do you want to come out and have lunch?" And I said, "Gee whiz, that's good." I hadn't seen Jim in maybe 10 years, but I said, "What do you want to talk about?" He said, "Well, I'd like to talk about a merger." And I said, "Well, I don't want to talk about a merger, but come on out and have lunch if you want to, but we're not going to talk about that." Make a long story short, he did come out, and because I had known Jim and knew I could trust him, and knew I could trust whatever he was telling me they were going to do, he did have a very interesting proposition, and I presented it to our equity holders, which were then Schubert, Zerbel, Cresswell had retired by then. There were 3 majors, myself and Zerbel and Schubert, and then I had about 6 others, including Dick Meeks and Marv White and Ron Howes and Bill Fritz, Gary Anderson. I've skipped one, I'm sure, in there. But anyway, we had 9 stockholders at the time, and I took the plan to them, and they agreed. That's in effect why NR wanted to buy us. And it was operationally treated as a merger. We maintained our name. We maintained everything that we had, other than we didn't have full ownership. We did have ownership of Young and Rubicam stock, which was in exchange for the CMS&Z stock that we had.
Did they say you could run your own show?
Oh, sure. Well, that was part of the deal. We wouldn't have wanted to mess with it if they had said anything otherwise. And what was useful there was that I knew I could trust them. If they said that, that's what we would do.
At this time,
That was 74.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any large accounts that probably helped them to?
They were enamored with the bore power thing as well, because they were in the process of looking at other agencies around the country, which would normally be considered to be regional agencies in non-metropolitan areas.
Did you tell us who Young and Rubicam was?
Young and Rubicam at the time was the largest agency in the U.S. and number 2 or 3 in the world. Major company with whom to associate. And they were early in the acquisition strategy. Like I said, this was early, 74 is when we joined. We were the second agency of the regional type to come in. The first was the company that you heard me mention earlier, Bruce B. Brewer, the Kansas City office. It was the only office they had left at that point, but they were the first agency.
So when you merged with the Young and Rubicam, could you foresee expanding your operation in Cedar Rapids?
We didn't do it for that reason, but what we could foresee was increased stability, because we knew we'd have more capital behind us. We knew that we were going to need to provide global services for certain selected clients here and there. It was an easier way to become a global agency quickly than building one all by yourself. It was helpful to us. We were very careful because shortly after we joined Young and Rubicam, we were pitching the Elanco products business, which was an herbicide owned by Eli Lilly. Very, very big one. I think at the time that was the biggest agricultural advertiser in the country. And they'd been working with an agency in Chicago, and they had guys that didn't know as much about the business as guys that lived in a cornfield like us. And that became apparent to them, and they began to look at us and others, and we made a major pitch.
You had a great advantage over these other companies because you were right in here in the heart and Midwest.
Well, exactly. And they were quick to spot that, and we emphasized that, of course. But in the process of making the presentation, Bob Book, who was the number 2 guy at Elanco then, made a point of saying that, now, you told me about your relationship with Young and Rubicam and all that, and that's swell. But do they have to approve the recommendation that you're going to make to us? Because if that's the case, we don't need you. We could work directly with them. And we don't want to work directly with them. We want to work with you. Well, the answer to the question, of course, was no. We don't have to ask Young and Rubicam for permission to make recommendations to our clients. We make the recommendations we think are appropriate. Good. That's what we want you to do. And we got the business. And that was a very important business for us.
In the 1976 timeframe, did you decide that it was time to expand and move out of Merchants National Bank?
Well, we didn't have any choice. We were beginning to really roll here, and we could see major growth coming. And as we...
What were your billings at this time then?
Well, as we acquired the Elanco business, which, as I said, was the biggest agricultural advertiser in the country at the time, they darn near doubled us, and we were in the $17-18 million range, thereabouts, as I remember it. And we were stumbling all over ourselves. We had to hire a lot of people. This was the equivalent of about a $10 million client, which was a big client in those days and still is. And we had maybe 30, 35 people working on that business, not full time. Some worked full time, but we had to hire more people. So we had more space, and we'd been growing through the early 70s, and we needed more space. And we, at the same time, wanted to do something that would be a little more interesting than living in a downtown office building, which was pretty conventional. We talked about the wonders of living in the Midwest, and we really thought it would be important to put an agency together, a building together in a fun place to live. And we chose an area out near Edgewood Road, just off Glass Road, that we named Signal Ridge. It was very heavily wooded. We bought about 30 acres there. Took 6 of it for this particular building. And Tom Popa at OPM did a marvelous architectural work for us. His ambition as he started to do that was to have, no matter where you were standing in the building, he wanted you to be able to see outside. And except in a couple of places like the furnace room in the lower level, we pretty well accomplished that. We had lovely views. There were windows in every office. Every office was the same size, by the way, which was kind of unique at the time. There was no status symbol from the corner office, so everybody had 10 by 12. And they had essentially the same furniture. I did allow myself the privilege of having 2 of those offices because I needed extra space for clients who would come in various conferences. But my own workspace was 10 by 12 like everybody else's, which adjoined a little conference room.
You had
that was like 76 or so that we designed and built that building.
You had a near catastrophe before you ever moved into it, didn't you?
We had a major near catastrophe. On the 4th of July, we were scheduled to move in on about the 1st of August of 76. 4th of July weekend, Marv White was showing the building to a friend who was in town, and he happened to get around to the back of the building, and he discovered that a leak had been coming out of the back of the center of the building in the lower level, a water leak, and had eroded the sand, which was going from the edge of the building clear down into a ravine, and by the time he got there, it had dug a major piece
gully.
of ground and a big gully and trees down, and we were in danger of losing the building because it was right in the center of the building, and as you can see from the picture, much of the weight from that would be much of the foundation that was supporting that building at that point was washed away. Popo was terribly proud of the way that thing held up because it didn't have a crack in the bricks, no separation of any sort. But we had a major potential problem there. We did ruin all of the plaster in the lower level. What had happened was the plumber had come to make the major hookup on the Friday night and not tighten that hookup down just right. And so it had begun to leak and it drained across the floor and out the back door and begun to take the sand and just push it aside. And it was all sandy soil in that part of the city. And had Marv not been there when he was, who knows what kind of a building we would have had left. The entrance, our entry to the building was delayed about an extra month because we had to put in all new plaster in the lower level, rip up the carpeting and do all that again. But all things considered, we felt we were very, very lucky to avert what could have been much, much worse.
Yeah. So in the 70s and approaching the 80s, was your firm strictly into advertising, or did you also do public relation service?
We were primarily advertising most of the way until we began to get into the late 70s. We had put some particular emphasis on design, and we had Gary Anderson heading a separate design unit that was originally called Design 4 and FORE 4, and then subsequently it was called Signal Design as we moved into the new building. But the next special service that we really thought needed emphasis was public relations. And in '77, as I recall, I was able to persuade Rick Mays, who was at the Amana Refrigeration Company. He was their PR director there. I had a vision that said that you can't just be an advertising agency forever. You're going to have to do more things than that to satisfy the communications needs of clients if you intend to grow. And PR was the first logical thing beyond straight advertising. But it had to be done by a professional that really understood public relations, not just news release writing. And we didn't need suede shoe hacks of the Hollywood type. We needed solid communicators who understood public relations. Rick Mays understood that he could do, if we could commit to ourselves to keep it separate from the advertising, that we could permit him to run a PR firm, he could build one. Well, we started with Rick and about a half-time associate. But as time went on, Rick was what I called a Nazi admiral. He had all of the attributes of a Nazi admiral. He was indeed a retired, not a retired, he was an active a reserve admiral. But he had all of the as I said, the attributes of a strong-willed, tough, this is the way we're going to do it kind of a guy. He was highly disciplined, which is terribly important in the PR business because you cannot tolerate any errors of any sort. You can't tolerate them in the advertising business either, but it's even more important that everything be spelled properly and everything is put together the way the newspapers need it, or the radio stations need it. If you're going to encourage people to do stories on your clients, you've got to do certain things fundamentally correct. He knew how to do that, and he wanted so badly to really put together an important PR resource, again, in an unlikely place, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And as an adjunct of an advertising agency, that was unlikely. Nobody had really done that. To make a long story there short, that business ended up as about a $3 million fee business with 30, 40 people in 6 offices. Mays was very, very good, and he was so dedicated. He was focused. Nothing changed him from where he was going.
Was this about the time that the City of Five Seasons slogan come about?
That was earlier. That was in the late 60s. The Five Seasons effort came from an assignment from the Chamber of Commerce to do a simple little brochure. And again, as I said earlier, we tried never to talk about better and best, but to differentiate things in memorable ways that said, in effect, what story we wanted to say. Well, City of Five Seasons, we felt, could say this is a great place to live because the 5th season is time to enjoy the other 4, which we think, and to this day, that's an imaginative way of saying this is a pretty good place to live. Many of us were familiar with having lived and commuted in places like Minneapolis and Chicago and New York. We knew how ugly that could be. And if you could get people's attention with saying this is a better place to live without saying that, you had a pretty good leg up. The city was interested in recruiting people and businesses. We were interested in recruiting people.
You were also involved with Iowa, a place to grow, too.
And that had come even ahead of, that came about the same time. We worked for the Iowa Development Commission, whose business was building business. And the fundamental thing that was saleable relative to Iowa was we had workers who worked. And we visualized big, strong faces with a simple headline, workers who work. We wrote a lot of short headlines like Bore Power and Workers Who Work. And the workers who work lead you to a place to grow. Iowa being a place to grow, you could look at that financially, spiritually, scholastically. You could do a lot of growing in Iowa, and that was the campaign. We had a little symbol for it that it was a kind of a circle on four sides. It was likened to four toilet seats hooked together in the middle by some of the people who didn't think it was very appropriate, including a cartoonist at the Register in Des Moines who kind of spoofed it.
In the 80s, didn't one of your partners decide to resign and you merged with another group?
Two things happened. As I recall, it was 80, but as we were moving into the late 70s, we were doing very, very well, and we were really on a continual roll that continued through the 80s, by the way. We had the PR thing going, and Bob Schubert at that point decided that he'd had enough advertising agency work. And we weren't really going quite the direction then that Bob really wanted to go with his professional life, and he said, I think I'll just resign and sell my stock and take my money and go do some securities work, which he did. At the same time, we acquired a company in Des Moines called Foltz Lacasse. That was the major advertising resource in Des Moines, where incidentally we had always done a lot of work in Des Moines. We did more work in Des Moines than Des Moines agencies did in Des Moines. But it became a good thing to do to expand our base from a people standpoint by acquiring Foltz Lacasse. And as we did that, to acknowledge that Foltz had joined the company and to also address the fact that Schubert was leaving, Schubert volunteered, why don't you just take my initial out of there and replace it with an F. And suddenly we were CMF&Z and went on about our business, which was a gracious thing for Bob to do. And it accommodated what Bill Foltz wanted to do, and it accommodated what I wanted to do. And the clients got the message that Schubert is retired and Foltz is here. CMF&Z, 1980.
Did you then become executive vice president of the?
That came a couple of years later. I believe that was in '82 when I was asked to take over a new job within Young and Rubicam, which was the general corporate supervision of the other agencies like ourselves. At the time, there was Brewer in Kansas City, and ours was number 2. We had an agency in St. Pete. We had one in Houston. We had one in San Diego. We had one in Cincinnati, and we had one in New York. And they were all in what was, except for the New York one, they were in non-metropolitan, major metropolitan areas, which are at that time considered to be only Chicago, L.A., and New York. As the agency business went, that was a metropolitan area. So we had these 7 or 8, 9 smaller regional-oriented agencies, all of whom were good, capable people, profitable shops, but they needed somebody to kind of look after them from a corporate point of view. And we'd had less than stellar success with people in New York doing that because, well, they asked me if I wanted to move to New York to take on this job, and I said absolutely not. And they said, good, because you're far more credible doing this work coming out of Cedar Rapids than if you came out with a New York address on your card. There's a New York mentality that people seek to develop, And certainly there's a perception of New Yorkers by the outsiders that this guy is going to come and tell me everything I already know, and he doesn't know as much as I do. So let's keep New York out of this picture. So that was part of the strategy in putting me in there.
Yeah.
Also, I was a little older, had indeed built a shop. Seemed to be a good candidate, and I jumped at it. It was fun for me to take that work. And that became, it was 82.
Yeah. Who was some of your major competitors in this time frame?
Fletcher Mayo was probably as big a direct competitor as we thought we had. That was an agency that was headquartered down in St. Joe. And they had some of the Elanco business, and we had the majority of it, but they had some of it. And we competed head-to-head from time to time.
Was there a Three Arts Incorporated?
Three Arts was in Cedar Rapids. But they were not really of the same size, or they weren't recognized in the same way nationally. They did some very good work. Larry Buchanan, who was the creative brains of that operation, did outstanding work, and he was a very, very good guy. They did some great work for Vigortone. We talked one time about possibly merging with them, but there wasn't any real reason to do it. They weren't particularly interested. We weren't particularly interested. It didn't happen. Fultz was a more likely prospect in Des Moines than Three Arts. But the primary competition we felt was from elsewhere, not Cedar Rapids. Most of our business, you see by now, was out of Cedar Rapids. We did not more than 10-12% of our business in Cedar Rapids. It was coming from Des Moines, Indianapolis, and other places in the country.
I had read an article where Bill Munsell was the type of person that did all of his thinking on his feet, and you very seldom sat down at your desk.
Well, Weaver Whitworth was the guy who, in Cedar Rapids, I think, invented the stand-up desk. He didn't invent it, but he popularized it, I suppose. I like the notion of a stand-up desk because I think your head sets in a different way when you're sitting versus standing. So I installed a stand-up desk when we moved into Signal Ridge, and I had it right alongside a nice window that gave me a lovely view. But I preferred it because I thought it kept me a little more alert. But there was another advantage of having the stand-up desk. When I was standing, and people might come to stick their head in my desk, and I'm in my office and say, "What do you think about such and such?" That conversation went a whole lot quicker if I stood than if I sat. And by then, we're getting to having quite a few people. We had 120 or so of them in Cedar Rapids. And time saved in direct communication with people was important. But it was quickly apparent to me that if I let anybody come in and sit down, and the signal there was if I sat down, they'd sit down. That was a longer meeting and a longer discussion than it really needed to be. But I also think it helped my back to not sit and slouch like I'm having to do now. And I think you stay a little more alert when you're on your feet.
Did you your company have good relations amongst the employees?
Oh, I think we were super in that department.
Perks and bonuses for them, the incentives?
We had a profit sharing program that I think was important. We had 9 stockholders, as I mentioned, which was somewhat unusual in a company of our size. New York used to say to me, "Well, why are you dividing so much of the profits up among so many people?" I said, "Well, because so many people do the work, and we wouldn't have the profits if they weren't doing the work." It seemed fairly fundamental to me, but it was not a conventional way of managing people to divide the profits as deeply as I was doing that. So in addition to the stockholder accruals of value, we had a profit sharing plan that we called it the Goodyear Christmas bonus. It was done at Christmas time, but it was not a Christmas bonus. It was a bonus that reflected having had a good year. And I think only 1 year did we not do that. But people understood that if we work hard and do well, we'll get something out of this in and around Christmas time, which is a nice time to do it. The most popular perk I ever introduced was the lawn care service that we provided to senior members of the firm, the officers, the vice presidents. Had to be a vice president to get this, but the strategy there was we always had a lot of work to do, and people would frequently like to come in on Saturday mornings or nights to get work done. This whole agency was built on the general notion of whatever is best for the client is going to be best for the agency and its people. So input related to what's best for clients. So it was common to work nights, weekends, but sometimes in the summertime especially, that sort of a approach to business, an attitude toward business got in the way of mowing the lawn and little things like that around the house. So I took care of that by hiring a lawn care. Didn't have a lot of lawn care services then, but I just took away the need to rake or take care of your yard in any way. The whole thing was taken care of by the company. Wives thought that was terrific. They appreciated that more than the guys, I think.
Did you have a large turnover, or were the employees quite dedicated once they got their feet on the ground?
I can't respond to that numerically because I don't remember those numbers, but we had as the agency business goes, we had quite a stable population. We did, however, have turnover because we were training a lot of people who went to other agencies around the world, because if they had been a CMF&Z person, it was instant credibility for their credentials. So we trained a lot of people.
How was CMF&Z ranked among other ad and public relation agencies at this time, Bill?
We didn't pay a lot of attention to that, but there were some 2,600 agencies, I think, in the country at the time. We were somewhere in the 90s by the time you're talking about. 97, I think, runs in my mind. The PR division had gotten to the point where they were 39th among PR agencies exclusively, which was Mays had wanted to get into the top 50 from the day he started, and that was a great achievement to do that. And he got past top 50, he got up as high as 39. We were clearly the biggest agency in Iowa. We were one of the biggest in Chicago, counting the Chicagos and Minneapolis.
Actually, your company was known as the Madison Avenue?
We were Madison Avenue in a cornfield, which was fine with me because after we smartened up and figured out we can't be a packaged goods agency in a funny place like Cedar Rapids, you can be a agricultural firm living in a funny place. So the fact that people began to call us Madison Avenue in a cornfield, pardon me, was fine with me because it emphasized the point.
So how far had your company come by this time since you first started out in '62?
Well, through the 80s we really rolled, and in terms of adding people and adding clients and making money, we did very, very well. As I think I said earlier, when I came back from California in '62 to the W.D. Line Company, we were in the range of $2 million with 25 or 30 people. And I made the bold prediction that we were going to get to 10 million. And about half the people in the agency thought I was nuts, and the other half thought maybe there's something good's going to happen here. Well, by the late 80s, let's say by 89 or 90, we were pushing 100 million in gross billings, which was really an unheard of mark. That was as far out as the 10 million was in its time. And we had 200 plus employees. We had offices in Cedar Rapids, Des Moines. We had a PR office in New York, one in Washington, one in San Diego, one in Orlando. I think that was all of them. 200 plus employees. So we went from 25 to 200 in 20 years, I guess I was. No, 30 years. 40 years, pardon me. 62 to, wait a minute, 62 to 90 is what we're talking with.
So at your peak, how many of your large accounts can you rattle off?
Well, the big ones at that time would have been Elanco, Pioneer, John Deere, Blue Cross in Des Moines. We did a little work with the lottery, the Iowa Development Commission. We worked here with Merchants National Bank. Hy-Vee was a big client throughout, as I said, beginning in about '83 or so.
Did you mention John Deere?
John Deere was in there. Massey Ferguson had been in there at one point when they had a major plant in Des Moines. They helped us get into the ag business as well. I'm sure I've overlooked. Syntex was a key client.
Dow Chemical?
Dow Chemical came in the 90s. No, pardon me, the late 80s.
You even did St. Luke's Hospital here in Cedar Rapids?
We did that for a long time. Well, that was in the days when it wasn't fashionable to advertise hospital services. And there were a lot of people in the community, on the board at both hospitals who didn't think the hospital should be doing that. Well, it was like colleges. They didn't advertise colleges then either. But
were you still doing radio and TV?
oh, we did everything: radio, television, direct. We did a lot of direct, a lot of newspaper, a lot of magazine. We did everything there was to do outdoor, because at that stage of the game, we were big enough that for one client or another, you need to do different things. So we were into everything.
In the mid '80s, in the '80s, there was a downturn in the farm economy. Did this affect?
I don't recall that had major impact on our business because we were growing through acquiring clients. But yes, there was a downturn in there. We lost bore power at one point because we were working for Elanco, and Elanco competed head-to-head with Monsanto on chemicals. And there was a guy running the Monsanto chemical into their business at that time that didn't think that it was appropriate for us to be giving aid and comfort to the enemy there by working with Elanco on one day and bore power on the next. And so we lost it, which was too bad. But that happens in this business.
Did you ever have to resign a client?
Yeah, we resigned Pioneer at one point, which was a big client, and we resigned McLeod at one point.
At what point or what year did you retire from the company, Bill?
I retired from CMF&Z when I was 65. It was a mandatory. It was a Young and Rubicam mandatory that at age 65 everybody goes and does something else. So in 1990, I was 65, and in 1st of April, which was right after my birthday, 90, I left CMF&Z. Shortly thereafter, I was delighted that Y&R came to me and said, how'd you like to go do a job that we have in Moscow? And I knew, I was pretty familiar with that whole thing because we'd helped the Moscow agency do some things. And I knew that the guy who'd been running the Moscow office was going to be leaving, and there was an opening there, and I was delighted to be asked to go in there. That was Young and Rubicam was the first Western agency to establish any kind of a beachhead in the USSR. That was in '89. But by '90, the guy who had been responsible for doing that was given another assignment elsewhere in the company, which made the opening into which they shoved me.
What part of Moscow were you assigned to?
Well, we were
The town.
Moscow?
Yeah, in Moscow.
Moscow is a town. Moscow is a city.
Well, I'm sorry. I had here as Silvero.
No, that's an agency.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Back up.
Okay, yeah.
Keep going.
Keep going. That's right.
Moscow was the capital of the USSR, capital of Russia, and within the Russian system, which was of course totally owned, they had a company called Silvero. Silvero Veneshtor Reklama. Veneshtor Reklama means advertising. And Silvero was state-owned, but they were interested in having somebody from the West, like us, come teach them things that they need to know about Western marketing and Western communications. So they established, the government and Young and Rubicam established a joint venture called Y&R Silvero. We put up all the money. They put up 12 or so people. They made it possible to get decent space, which was not easy. They made it possible to get decent space for our Americans to live. There were two of us. And we were very much a favored by the state agency because we were partners, and we were the first ones to do that. Along with that was the responsibility that we would do some teaching, and that was what we did. We taught people fundamentals. It wasn't marketing 101, it was marketing 1. Well, to tell you, I won't try to describe the entire Moscow experience, but to give you an understanding of the sophistication of the community there, I can tell you there's no phone book, and everything else is on the same level. So if you can imagine doing business in a society that has no phone book or any of the other things that you would expect at that level, that gives you a clear understanding of what we were up against. We worked a lot of times doing nothing that you could see, and I would usually leave the office about 11 o'clock at night and go to my apartment, which was in the adjacent building, and I'd ask myself, what'd you do today? And I would have to admit, not much, because a lot of time was spent setting up the meeting for the meeting, and it's a different society.
Did you speak Russian?
Pardon me?
Did you speak Russian?
I did not. The other partner there, Mike Adams, who was the PR guy in this equation, he spoke Russian, and of course all the Russians spoke Russian, and the Russians, with the exception of one, spoke English. I was wanted to be there for 2 years, decided wrongly not to study the language because it would take too much time. I didn't need it to get along, but it would have helped if I could have. It is intimidating to go out, and my wife was intimidated being on the streets there because you can't even read the street signs and you can't read the store signs. You don't know whether that's a grocery store or a bar. And it's an intimidating experience without the language, and I didn't have it, but you can get by.
Yeah.
We had good English-speaking Russian people with us.
How was you treated?
Fine.
By
As I
the
said,
public?
we were from a business point of view, we were kind of favored folks, and we had guys in that company who knew how to get things done. We had one guy, Yuri Pashin, who is now running the business. He knew how to go find things, and we would say, Yuri, do you suppose we can find some statistics that would tell us how many of this and how many of that and how many of the other? And they didn't have those in public availability, no business libraries. But Yuri knew how to go find things out. And Yuri would come back and he'd say, and he'd smile and he'd say, here it is. I said, Yuri, how'd you get that? Can't tell you. Can't tell you.
Then when you come back in '92, Bill, did you cut your ties with Young and Rubicon?
I came back in '92, and I came back in part-time in '91. My wife, Nancy, had been diagnosed with cancer. Moscow was no place to treat that. I needed to be here more than I could treat Moscow. So by '92, we had done everything we could do by long distance. And we came to agree that I should halt my career in Moscow. And at the same time, that really kind of terminated my work with Young and Rubicam. That's the point at which I cashed out.
What was going on with the CMF and Z company at this time?
CMF and Z, as it moved into the '90s, plateaued, and the business began to change a lot. Things were different. Things needed to be done differently. We had different management then. Buzz Baker was running the place at that stage of the game. Foltz was still in Des Moines. But things were different, and the people were managed differently, and things were tough all over, and things didn't go very well. As they went through the '90s, I believe it was in '94, the employees were able to buy back 2/3 of what Young and Rubicam owned. So it ceased to be a totally owned Young and Rubicam affiliate. It was 1/3 Young and Rubicam, I believe, roughly, and the employees owned 2/3 of it. So that was a change. But things did not go well. The sad story about that whole situation is that as we went on through the '90s, things were on a clear downward spiral. That culminated in 2002, in January of 2002, a guy in Chicago who was heading a company called 3I, acquired the company, and within 6 or 7 months he had run it literally into the ground, and the whole thing was closed up, and the doors were locked, and that was the end of that. All the employees were fired. All the clients were resigned. Nothing remained of CMF&Z, with the exception of a little service unit called Bridgepoint. That was the advertising verification service, which had been a good moneymaker and a good service to have added to PR and design and other things. That was all that was left. It was sold. I tried to buy it, wasn't able to do that. But the thing then went down the tubes, as they say, much to the dismay of many of us who had been there through a good many years. I had phone calls. It was like a death in the family. People would call, and they were so sorry to have heard and so sorry to have read. And it was a sad situation.
Yeah.
But it was a great chapter in our lives.
Yeah. It had been very traumatic for you.
It was.
Have you gotten over it?
I don't think so.
Probably not. It was your life that went down the drain.
Well, it was an awful lot of my life. It was certainly my business life. And I've got a lot of family life. You're going to start with it, Laurel.
Bill, tell us about your family.
My family is a big family. Pardon me.
What is this picture we're looking at here? Was this some occasion?
Well, that's all the kids I had at the time, which was 7. And that marked the occasion of moving into the house in which I presently live. My wife Nancy and I had started building this house when she was still living. She did 90-some% of the planning and the decorating in concert with Larry Roberts, but she never got to live here. She died in February of '93. The date this picture was taken was roughly June 15 of that year, which was the occasion that the family marked when I was able to get into the house. We'd opened it up that week, moved in. Kids came from all over, wherever they were, where they lived, all over the country, and brought the grandchildren with. That represents a collection of 7 children there, which was the family at the time. And I don't know how many grandchildren there were there.
Who's the little baby on the left?
That must be Kelly. Kelly Hayes, and her husband. She's being held by Joe Hayes and daughter Chris is the mother of that group. They're the only 2 girls in the whole crowd. We have all boy grandchildren here.
Mm-hmm. And the picture up on top?
Well, the picture up on top was shot the day that Kathy and I were married. That was in June of '96. And as you can see, that was a pretty good-sized tribe, too. Her brothers, of whom there are 5 brothers and sisters, they were all there. Her mother and stepfather were there. All of my kids and grandchildren were there. I don't know how many people that is, but it's quite a group. All told, Kathy brought along 2 children. And if you want to stop a moment, you can pick that up on the other wall.
And who are we looking at here, Bill?
Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, Kathy brought 2 children to this family. I had 7 when she and I were married, and she brought along Carrie and Julie. That brought us to a total of 9. With their help, we've gotten now to a total of 12 grandchildren, and we're scheduled for a 13th sometime this weekend out in Sacramento. Kathy will be going out there to oversee that event, and that'll bring us to a grand total of 13 grandchildren.
Very nice. Bill, unless you have any more memories to share with us, the Cedar Rapids History Center, the Linn County Historical Society would like to thank you very much for sharing your memories with us.
I don't have any last-minute reflections. I've been blessed through all my life, really, to have had great good health, good family support, great friends. And I think we had a good many friends within that company at CMF&Z. I still hear from many of them today. I still consider many of them very good and close friends. They are. And without those people, we wouldn't have had much, because we've talked largely about my contribution today, but that was a small part of the peanut compared to the whole package. We had 200 and some people who were the ones that really made it work.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.